I suffer from hypnopompic hallucinations. Sounds like a mouthful, right? The explanation is a lot simpler than the name. Basically, I see things when I wake up from a deep slumber. Sometimes, said hallucinations are small, rats, bugs, strange patterns in the walls. Others have a tendency to be a tad more theatrical. When I was 13, I saw a human-sized tarantula crawl down from the wall onto the foot of my bed. That was the first time I'd ever had a flare-up, my made-up term. It was also the first time I'd pissed myself while screaming. These night visions would show up here and there during my teens, then vanish almost entirely during my 20s. I say almost entirely because I'm 29 and they started happening again a few months ago. The hallucinations were the same, and they began to repeat themselves every night. The scenario was simple, yet horrifying. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to see a small, gray creature climbing on the wall across from me. Imagine a putty from the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers fucked the creature from the Black Lagoon, and you'd have a basic idea of what I'm trying to describe. While the overall narrative would remain the same, how the creature reacted would differ from night to night. Sometimes, it would catch insects out of the air with its amphibian-like tongue. Other times, it would just sit in a frozen pose, staring at me with those giant glass eyes. After a while, I'd either rub my eyes or scream, only to see that my imaginary intruder had vanished into the night. Needless to say, I could only take waking up to some shit like that for so long. I decided to get some professional help for once. I know that seems minuscule by today's standards, but I always prided myself on not being one of those people who had to report to a therapist every week. The first visit turned out to be nothing like I expected. The psychiatrist I spoke to was laid back and empathetic. He explained that my hallucinations could be linked to pockets of stress I may have been processing the wrong way. He offered to enroll me in a new system they had been utilizing for people who suffered from sleep-based disorders. He called it remote viewing, not to be confused with that weird psychic sketching thing of the same name. Because the program was still in the testing phases, I wouldn't have to pay a dime for it. I heard free and signed on the dotted line. The program involved someone installing a camera in my bedroom. The camera would function automatically, activating at night to monitor me while I slept. The video files would then be uploaded to a private server, where my psychiatrist would then be able to observe my flare-ups when they happened. Based on the accumulated data, he'd get better insight into the length and complexity of each episode. I didn't see the wall monster in those first few weeks, but I did have a shit ton of other hallucinations to pick up the slack. As weird as it was having a camera pointed at my bed, I couldn't deny how effective those long-hour sessions were becoming. Seriously, I was beginning to realize all the mental blocks that I had set up for myself over the years. As time went by, I began to feel less burdened and more confident in myself. More confident than I had ever been, to be honest. I tested this newfound confidence on my neighbor, Anya. She had moved next door in the months prior, and I had the biggest crush on her. She was from Germany and looked like an absolute goddess. Up until that point, the only words we managed to exchange were the hellos and goodbyes expected of any cordial neighbor. I blew all that out of the water by asking her to dinner. Her initial answer was, maybe another time. I thought that was code for, I'd never go out with you, but as it turned out, she was actually telling the truth. A few days after our first awkward encounter, she knocked on my door and told me she'd be free that Friday evening. We went to the Olive Garden, and she wore this amazing red dress that only seemed to enhance her beauty, something I thought was impossible. Turns out, I was more wrong than I knew. She told me the majority of her life story. She had lived in the States for nearly a decade. She met a guy, got pregnant twice, then the guy decided to bounce. She was still adjusting to life as a single mother, a lifestyle that severely chipped away at any semblance of a dating life. The whole maybe another time thing was due to her not being able to find a babysitter with such short notice. I'll have to admit that the single mom part threw me for a bit of a loop. My apprehension would only be temporary. I felt bad for her, kids or not. I couldn't understand why any man would consciously pass up the chance to date such a woman. I could tell that after she fully opened up about her life and kids, her demeanor shifted from defensive to relaxed. From that point on, the night was perfect. I was obviously into her, and as the night progressed, I could see that she was just as into me. I could start to see the feeling was mutual. Maybe she was just happy that I hadn't made a run for the hills at any point during the date. I never expected things to go as far as they did, so you can understand how shocked I was when she insisted on having a nightcap at my place. We had crazy, passionate sex for what felt like hours. It would have been the best sex of my life if there wasn't one single detail that repeatedly took me out of the moment. I noticed that while I had stripped down to the full birthday suit, she was still wearing that dress, only she had maneuvered it up to her waist. Every time I tried to get that dress off of her, she'd simply knock my hand away in protest. I assumed she was self-conscious about her body. I collapsed beside her after my body reached the point of exhaustion. I may have been beat, but I felt like she could have gone on for a few more rounds. She was like a machine. I awoke to find her gone the following morning. While there was nobody laying next to me, there was a handwritten note from her telling me what a wonderful time she had and how she couldn't wait to do it again. On the back of the note, she had written her phone number. I was on cloud 9. I called her that night and made plans for a second date later in the week. My post-date glow lasted into my therapy session. I was about to explode with all the things that I wanted to tell the doctor about. Anya, the date, the nightcap. More importantly, how things in my life were beginning to look up for once. As I entered the office, my smile faded once I saw my psychiatrist's own grave expression. I asked him what was wrong. After stuttering wildly for a few minutes, he forced himself to mouth the words he had been struggling with since my arrival. You need to watch this, he said while wiping the accumulated beads of sweat from his forehead. Still in a state of confusion, I watched as he spun the computer monitor around until it was facing me directly. My eyes widened as the footage started to play before me. The screen was bathed in night vision. I was watching myself in the bed, curled up to Anya. We were both in a deep sleep. A pang of embarrassment jumped into my throat once I understood the context of what I was watching. I had such a good time with Anya that night, I totally forgot that there was a camera recording in the room. I looked up at my psychiatrist without looking directly in his eyes. I am so sorry about that. I completely forgot about the camera, I nervously sputtered out. The doctor promptly shushed me before pointing his finger excitedly to the monitor. Looking back down at the screen, I caught what he was trying to make sure I didn't miss. Crawling down the wall, above my headboard, was my hallucinatory creature. It looked just as I remembered. That's when I got a cold chill. If I was watching that creature on the screen, then it wasn't a hallucination. It was very real. Neither Anya or myself moved while the monster climbed down from the wall, exploring various parts of my room. The monster turned its sights to Anya, crawling uncomfortably close to the sleeping woman, before it bit one of her fingers. Anya sprang up in the bed, her eyes made contact with the freak of nature. She didn't scream. She wasn't afraid in the least. She lowered her head and began to whisper to it. She then got out of the bed and headed over to a chair in the corner of the room. Once situated, Anya pulled the top part of her dress all the way down. Underneath, she wore what looked like a girdle. Carefully, Anya removed the undergarment as well. 2 normal breasts sat on both sides of her chest. Underneath was a different story. Below the human breasts were 6 animal-like nipples, 2 rows of 3, side by side, like a large dog or cat. I watched as Anya picked the monster up, nestling it close so that it would be able to find one of the elongated nipples so it could nurse. As the monster began to suckle at the uncomfortable-looking Anya, I noticed a second figure, a second monster, crawling down the wall to join the first. The second monster snapped at the first. The 2 get into a silent scuffle before Anya guides the second to a free nipple. She was nursing her 2 children. Once the children were done nursing, Anya shooed them away. The 2 monsters crawled back into the wall, then crawled out of sight. Once they were gone, Anya crawled back into the bed, running her hand through my hair. I felt sick to my stomach. My mind started racing as I wondered just how they were able to get into my room. The image of a large vent flashed into my head. It's the large vent that sat in the corner across my room. They were using the apartment ventilation system to move around the property at night. The vent in my room was more than big enough for them to fit through. I remember how I unscrewed the metal cover years ago and never bothered to put the screws back in. I never went back to that apartment. I left all of my stuff there. I left the city. To this day, I don't know what the hell Anya is, or was, and I'll be happy if I can live the rest of my life without finding out. I've since moved back in with my parents, who conveniently live on the other side of the country. I'm even sleeping in my old room, at least until I get back on my feet. Every night, I wonder if I'll look up and they'll be there. Anya with those demonic things in her arms. So far, I have yet to see them in any capacity. So far, I've just been visited by the usual suspects. I hallucinated that goddamn tarantula again. It's worth noting that the 13-year-old me's jaw would drop if he knew that I was actually relieved to see it for a second time.